Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. Welcome to this session on the experience and the impact of Science Meets Parliament in Canada. I'm speaking today from the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, Ontario, situated on the territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. Our limestone buildings were literally cut from the land and reshaped in the colonial pattern. And for this, I want to acknowledge the land with thanks, to acknowledge the harm with humility, and to accept the obligations that acknowledgements like this demand. So I'll open our panel today with a brief introduction to Science Meets Parliament. But first, I'm very pleased to introduce our panel of researchers and parliamentarians, all of whom participated in the 2018 pilot program. So I'd like to welcome Senator Rosa Galvez, Senator from Quebec, Matt Genereux, a member of Parliament representing Edmonton Riverbend, Valerie Crooks, professor at Simon Fraser University, Catherine Ma, an associate professor at Dalhousie University, Trushar Patel, my co-moderator and associate professor at the University of Lethbridge, and Dominique Robert, professeur à l'Université de Québec à Rimouski. Bonjour, bienvenue à tous, et thank you all for agreeing to share your perspectives. So now I'd like to take no more than a few minutes to provide a brief background on Science Meets Parliament, its goals, its impact, and our outlook for the future. So Science Meets Parliament is a program that has its roots in Australia. It's been running there for more than 20 years. I found out about it through a chance encounter with an Australian who had participated in the program, and it really changed how she approached research and training, and how she thinks about impact of research. So taking this from the Australian constellation of science policy groups and adapting it for the Canadian experience, we wanted to bring that experience that they had gathered with us. Firstly, the program needs to be reliably nonpartisan, non-lobbying. If we're going to separate it from other day on the hill lobby events and break through those kind of established tropes. Second, we needed a real focus on building relationships. So a long-term change in science and policy culture requires more than a lecture, which isn't really going to hit home anyways, given the time constraints that we have on a program like this. It needs a real meaningful connection, which we hope to engender through the meetings. It had to include professional development. Throwing an academic professor and a parliamentarian in a room together and hoping for the best was never going to be successful. And finally, we knew that we needed to build in diversity and inclusion from the outset if we were going to see this as a capacity building program for the national science community. So fortunately and coincidentally, the Canadian Science Policy Centre had just released its strategic plan, and the timing couldn't have been better. Under their Connect category, they had a very similar program with a similar intent. This, plus the CSPC's mandate for nonpartisan connection and capacity building, made it the natural home for a program like Science Meets Parliament in Canada. So Science Meets Parliament, I'm grateful again to Science and Technology Australia for allowing us to keep the name Science Meets Parliament. It includes these two institutions, two solitudes, connected by one friendly little verb. Our aim was to create the space for relationships at the personal level to develop between researchers working in Canada and our federal parliamentarians. So this would allow scientists to speak for science, to broaden and enrich Parliament's exposure to what science means and how it functions in Canada, and allow both groups to weave the outputs of research in Canada into the work of government and for the public good. And so we really hope that the function of that little verb in the middle would contribute towards continuing the affirmation of the use of science as a Canadian cultural touchstone. Our delegate selection, so who took part from the researchers' side? So again, our focus at the beginning was on diversity. You can imagine that it's difficult to achieve a level of diversity in a group of about 30 researchers, which we pulled in our program, pilot program. Considering all the dimensions of diversity that we have in Canada. So I was really happy that our strongest applicants aligned well with this goal of meeting diversity. You'll see that we had about 60% female involvement to 40% male. Gender parity aside, I think that that's fair to go a little bit majority for the women, since it's been 100% male for about 300 years. Visible minorities comprised about 40%. And we're not showing it here, but language diversity was a little bit off what we would have liked. I think we've improved that for this year, and it was due to more visibility in Quebec rather than any other meaning. And the granting agency, we had balanced between science and engineering, social sciences, and medical and health. Because again, even though it's the name Science Meets Parliament, we really wanted to take as broad an interpretation of science as we could to include engineering, social sciences. On the parliamentarian side, so we had about 10% of Parliament agree to participate as volunteers. So 35 members of Parliament and 8 senators. I'd like to point out that the graph for the members of Parliament may be slightly misleading, and not only because the Green Party is shown in yellow, but also it tends to give the impression that there was more of the Liberal Party, say, than the Conservative Party or the NDPs. And while this is true in absolute numbers, in terms of the fraction of members who volunteered from each party, it was effectively equal. And in fact, the first 3 MPs to accept the invitation, and so really reassure me that we were going forward, were all Conservative Party members from Alberta. And I'm really glad that Matt Genereux agreed to join us today, so that I can thank him for being one of those first 3. So what did we do? So arriving in Ottawa, we began with a meeting with the co-sponsor of the program, Dr. Mona Niemer, Canada's chief science advisor, who was very generous with her time. We then transitioned into a training session where the researchers learned more about parliamentary operations, effective communication strategies. They were exposed, and here we have a photo of another one of our panelists today, Senator Rosa Galvez, along with former MPs and party leaders, with a real focus on how are we going to achieve this personal relationship and connection. So finally, moving into the real keystone of the program are the meetings between the researchers and the MPs and senators. We left this the type of meeting to be as broad as possible. So as the parliamentarians had time and whatever they were willing or able to give us through the day. So that sometimes meant traditional one-on-one meetings in the office, shadowing for part or most of the day in some cases, breakfast or lunchtime meetings, group discussions, committee meetings. All of our researchers also attended a question period and got again a little peek behind the curtain for parliamentary operations throughout their time on the Hill. We wrapped the day with a really nice evening event, just so that all of the researchers and parliamentarians could come and share their experiences together. And we also featured 3 short keynotes from the Minister of Science and members of the opposition parties holding a science portfolio. And this for me was incredibly motivating, incredibly rewarding, just because we could see there all of the parties showing cross-party support for the key messages that research is a shared Canadian value and that Canadian science can strengthen Canadian public policy. So we move forward from the pilot. We're running the program again this year, adapting again and again as we have throughout the last 20 or so months. So what have we done? Invited more delegates. I think the pilot showed that we had the capacity to take on more researchers, although we wanted to keep it a smaller group to, again, engender the kind of cross connections between the researchers that we didn't plan, but was extremely exciting to see. We deepened the training program to have more involvement from the civil service, from more on the operation of government side, and to allow a little bit more time practicing the communication skills that would be so important. Of course, all of this training is being done remotely given the pandemic scenario. That's just reality. However, we're maintaining the requirement for in-person meetings in Ottawa because we still feel that there's incredible value in coming into the House, being invited into the space where government meets, and also for the researcher side to get a real sense of what they're competing with when they decide to engage with public policy. Okay, and in summary, so Science Meets Parliament. What is the program? It's a program to build and grow relationships between researchers working in Canada and federal parliamentarians to reinforce the public support and use of science, and again to really affirm it as a Canadian cultural touchstone. So here's the part when I'm giving this talk where I might talk about people's experiences that we've heard back from through surveys and collecting the information over the years. But now I get to ask the participants themselves, do we meet our goal? And with that question in mind, I'd like to hand it over to our panelists to give each of the speakers a chance to share their experiences with the program and to offer some opening thoughts on the need to build relationships between researchers and political decision makers before they're needed. So I'll kick us off with my co-moderator, Trushar Patel.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning and namaste. As Matt said, I'm Trushar from University of Lethbridge, located in Alberta. Before I begin, I'd like to thank all the organizers who worked really hard to implement the first or inaugural Science Meets Parliament that was held in Ottawa in 2018. I was really fortunate to represent Alberta and my university and learn many valuable lessons, as well as connect with many Canada research chairs, and we have done a few activities subsequently with those colleagues that we met at the Parliament Hill. By attending this event, I actually learned a lot. I obtained a really nice training for effective science communication, especially communicating science with individuals who are not expert in science and have diverse background. I also learned a lot more about the government and legislative processes in Canada with workshops, and actually how scientists and parliamentarians can build relationships and work together. Science Meets Parliament is one of the unique programs that facilitates a direct interaction between researchers from across Canada and parliamentarians. Through this program, I found that we really have an opportunity to initiate and strengthen discussions on how scientific evidence can be incorporated to formulate policies. Fun fact, I also learned that parliamentarians are highly adaptable to a lot of new topics, and they are very quick to grasp the knowledge about the topics if effectively communicated. So that was also one of the lessons that I learned. The impact of the lessons I learned, many of them, but I would highlight one of the most important recent example of the some of the skills that I learned in this program was that I was involved as a co-lead for return to campus operations at the University of Lethbridge for this fall semester, where we had planned for over 90% in-person teaching, research, and all the activities. And it was because of these some of the skills that I developed, I was able to communicate with various stakeholders at the university, from human resources um, to student services, to the president's executives, and the community to have them encourage for vaccines and masks and all of it. And we developed so many policies throughout this short period of time, and put the campus back together from virtual reality to in-person reality. So this was one of the major a lesson that I could learn and put it into actually practice. With that, we will go to Senator Rosa Galvez now.
Good morning. Hello. So happy to be here with you. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell you my experience with Science Meets Parliament. I hope one day all Parliament meets science, because it needs to be both ways. So my first experience was in 2018, when I was shadowed by scientist Dr. Mary Vera from UBC Faculty of Pharmaceutical Science, who's actually was featured as one of Canada's women leaders in STEM. As Peruvian, as an immigrant, as a mother, as a as a scientist in science, technology, and energy, engineering and mathematics, absolutely that I think that we are there. The presence of immigrant women in science is there, and it should be increased. So that was my first experience. I love to talk and to be followed by Mary, and which allow us to see my work in the parliament and all the facets. I also had the opportunity to speak on a panel, as the picture that were shown initially, with Medra Hariri, President and CEO of the Canadian Science Policy Conference, Dr. Ted Su, former MP and liberal critic of science and technology, and the Honorable Preston Manny, former Reform Party MP and former leader of the official opposition. It gave us the opportunity to address scientists and to communicate what we do in the parliament. Can you imagine solving the climate crisis and the pandemic crisis without science? It is unimaginable. It will take 4 decades. So science is so central to finding solutions to very difficult and specific problems. And science is there to develop new technology and to take us to this new fourth industrial revolution and to bring us to a more sustainable future for our generation and for future generations. So I think, well, I consider myself lucky because I have a very easy access to scientists. And since I am at the Senate and since 2016, scientists approach me from all kinds of fields and with all kinds of requests. And I had also the honor to during 2018 in 2018 to give the Canadian Canadian national lecture for the Canadian Society of Civil Engineering on the catastrophic event of Lac Megantic, which gave me the opportunity to went from coast to coast to coast and meet with scientists from the science and engineering faculty. So that was really good. So I don't see bad benefits to these interactions between parliamentarians and scientists. I really don't. I only see benefits. I believe in policy based on evidence, on facts. I sometimes believe too that science is not going fast enough, or they have to be very, very sure. Like take, for example, the last report on the IPCC that says unequivocally, but since the last 10 years, it is 99% of certitude that it's caused by human activity. So I know that scientists are very use always the precautionary principle, but sometimes I think that they have to communicate also assurances. And we needed this time. This every year counts in our fight against climate change and reducing emissions and adapting to the new climate. So I think that we just have to hurry up and make these bonds and this relationship stronger and more efficient. Thank you.
Thank you. So next we'll move on to Dominic Robert.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Matt. And good morning, everyone. So perhaps I could start with a few words on the motivations that I had for joining the Science Meet Parliament event. I'm based at the University of Quebec at Rimouski, and I hold the research chair in fisheries ecology. So my research program is very connected to the fishing industry, to the mandate of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And as you could imagine, my program targets research questions that matter for stock assessment and eventually for the management of marine resources. So that type of topic is very strongly connected to policies, and I always realized that this was a weakness on my part. The lack of knowledge on how policy making worked, and finally I was not ensured that I was doing my work the right way to make sure that it would feed correctly into policies. So when I saw the offer for joining such a program, Science Meets Parliament, I jumped on the opportunity. I applied, and I was very fortunate to be retained as a candidate. So my experience over there was I would say fantastic. It was enlightening, being hosted by the chief scientist advisor, Mona Niemer, to kick off the event, to then spend the whole afternoon with experienced people like Senator Galvez, doing workshops, learning how to to communicate science to politicians, learning how to prepare an elevator pitch, but for policymakers. So that was like a very useful and something that I had never had the chance to learn elsewhere. And on day two, on my part, I was shadowing two senators, so I could see how a day in the life of a senator works. And I understood it's a very busy life, going from meetings in the morning at her office to senatorial committees, and then there is the period of questions. So that was a very full day during which I could learn really how it works inside the parliament, what the reality is for parliamentarians. And so without that type of knowledge, it's very difficult to organize useful meetings with policymakers. But once, as a scientist, I know how it works, it makes it much easier. So I grew up in the process, and I would say that in terms of impact for myself, for my career, well, now I always consider in my research the communication aspect. I always question how to make research results more useful, not only to policy making, but just to the general public also. So since the event, I have been monitoring the activity of the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, which is in my research field. And I wrote a brief on one topic that covered my own expertise on the population dynamics of herring in Atlantic Canada. So I'm trying to get involved. I understand what it means, and I encourage my team also to do so. So very good experience for me, and I would recommend participation to anyone.
Thank you, Dominic. And I think I remember too, you and I got to experience a concert in the Carillon.
That's right. Yeah.
Something we won't be able to repeat until the center block's back in good shape. But what an experience. Okay, so now I'll hand it over again to Catherine Ma to share her experiences.
Thanks so much, and thanks for organizing this panel. Thanks for organizing the program. I'll start also with my motivation, and I have to go back to. I'll share a moment from when I had recently finished my clinical training. I'm originally from Calgary. I did my pediatric training in Newfoundland and Labrador, and then moved to Toronto, as one does, and started a community practice in general pediatrics. The same time, I was pursuing some graduate studies in health policy at the University of Toronto. And I recall very distinctly a day at the office, at the clinical office, where I had just come out of a treatment room, having had a conversation with a family about childhood vaccines. And the family was experiencing vaccine hesitancy. And the outcome of that particular conversation was that we didn't get the vaccinations done that day. But then as I was standing there, you know, in the hallway, and I remembered like in front of the Sharps box, thinking about immunization and just reflecting in my other work, in my PhD in policy, I was studying immunization policy. My work was on FPT relations in establishing matters of national concern around immunization policy. And just what struck me at that moment was, as a physician, I was dealing day to day with a certain type of scale in terms of making change in the lives of Canadians. And on the policy front, there was a whole different order of magnitude and scale in which these changes could happen. So that's a very kind of personal experience behind the motivation. So when the advertisements for Science Meets Parliament came around, it was just incredible to read the documentation and think, my God, this program was designed for me. How do I get involved in this? So I applied, and fortunately I was accepted to be part of that initial cohort. And what it meant to me was it meant just really bringing to life things that I had been working on in my science and in my teaching, but just really bringing it to life in a new and tangible way. So there's 4 things that I recall and I will always take with me and take forward. So I'm going to share those with you quickly. One was getting to meet former MP Ted Su. And actually, I had used a portion of the Hansard transcript from his speech on the long form census in my teaching for years. And then there he was in front of me at Science Meets Parliament. And I got to tell him having that experience of having students stand up in class and read his speech. And that was an incredible moment. A second thing was just being able to find common ground with parliamentarians that, you know, perhaps I identify on a different part of the political spectrum with, but it was so easy to have a conversation about science and through connection to community. And it was easy and very rewarding to have those conversations. I also remember having had the chance to meet with parliamentary staff and interns, and that was incredible. And it really reinforced the need for me as an instructor in the university setting to make those, let's say, policy and politics career paths open, or to support those pathways for those who also come in usually through science or through health studies, which is where I encounter them. And then the last thing is really just getting to spend time and meet all of these incredibly civically engaged scientists, to feel that there was somehow nationally a network of, you know, science avengers waiting to spring into action when there were policy needs arising. And that was incredible to me. So I'll just stop there, and thanks again.
Thank you, Catherine. And we'll go now to MP for Edmonton Riverbend, Matt Genereux, who is at the airport and graciously joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Matt and Tushar, and it's honored to be on such an esteemed panel here as well. I wouldn't miss it, but we had late night votes last night, so flights got changed. So long story short, in the Pearson airport, but someone who has a 20-month-old and not quite sure what's going to happen in the background. Usually when I'm doing these sorts of things, this is kind of, I guess, the same kind of situation. So I apologize for whatever happens in the background over the course of the I guess the panel here. Yeah, you know, seeing some of those photos, Matt, was takes you back to a time when I think we all had a lunch together up in the parliamentary restaurant, and those were fun times, and very, very excited to see that part of the commitment is to go back in person, because I certainly think that'll be a fun opportunity to show off Parliament again someone from Alberta who had never been to Parliament before I was elected. It was such a cool building growing up as a kid, and now be able to show it off to so many people that come and visit from across the country, including Science Meets Parliament, is one of my favorite things to do for sure. So I guess some of the things wanted to touch on a little bit from my perspective as the politician that everybody came to talk to. It was circled on my calendar for a long time leading up to the day, because I just don't think there's enough of that connection in the day-to-day world of the policymakers, particularly on the science file. And I was our science critic for, I think, a year and a half, and politicians understanding the level of something that, the basic and fundamental research is something harp about all the time in caucus, the benefits of it, and ultimately what the commitments we can make in Parliament to funding those types of research, what that then can lead to in the future. So I always use the example with my colleagues of the MRI machine. I said, who would have thought, 100 years ago that we would have went and said, yeah, that's a great idea to provide government funding for. And then suddenly, now it's a must need in every hospital across the country, and all coming out of that basic and fundamental research. So it may look sometimes, I tell them, like a pricey object on the budget sheet, but at the end of the day, it's something that we as elected officials need to pay more attention to, and also need to provide the supports required. So when that comes to universities, in Dominique and Valerie and Catherine's case, I think often I think a lot of people just think, oh, that's provincial jurisdiction, so there's not really any of that tie into Parliament. But it's simply not true. There's so much at the federal level that I believe that Parliament ends up supporting the university, and largely on the research front. So my friends Kirsty Duncan and I have these conversations all the time, and Mona Niebuhr is a great asset to have her in the science advisor chair. But just hearing the stories that come forward, and bring it from the labs, from the research papers, right to our couches, our boardroom tables, it's so important to get those messages across. So I think it's last thing. Maybe I'll say one more thing, Matt, before kind of letting you go to your Q&A, or I guess Valerie next. Imagine during the pandemic, if for something like, I'm at the airport, the aviation industry, for example, imagine if they didn't reach out to Parliament and say, you know what, we're kind of facing some hurdles during the pandemic. There probably would have been very little appetite for any sort of level of supports for an industry like the aviation industry. Whereas I think that's constantly the role of scientists, of your profession, of your universities, to really continue that advocacy at the Parliament level. There's lots of us who are excited about science, but there's so many politicians that get just inundated with so many things every single day from so many different sectors from across the country, that they want to do the work. They want to support the community, in our case, science. But I think it's just a matter of where they're picking their priorities, and if you're not in front of them pushing hard, it's hard to get through sometimes. So thrilled that Science in Parliament is going to continue on virtual, but again, hopefully sometime soon in person, and certainly look forward to being one of the first three, hopefully the first one to answer your email again, Matt, when it comes.
Great, thank you. And we'll round out this section with Valerie Crooks. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Well, I think the motivations that I had for joining Science Meets Parliament were pretty much covered, so I don't want to repeat anything. But one thing that I'll add that I was interested in doing was really sort of uncovering the mechanisms, or kind of revealing the curtain and looking past it and saying, okay, how does science actually move into action? in the parliamentary realm. And that's something that Science Meets Parliament did very well for me. I was able to understand issues that are quite complicated, including science literacy among elected officials, the channels through which information is actually uptaken, how potentially scientific information is evaluated as to whether or not it's sound enough to be included in policy debates and conversations. For me, I felt that was very important. As a social scientist, I think many social scientists are asked, well, how is your work policy relevant? Or what would policymakers do? These are questions that we're asked all the time, and we ask of graduate students in defenses. And oftentimes the answers to those types of questions still have a lot of intangibility around them because they don't incorporate the specific mechanisms and mechanics behind moving science and policy, or moving science into policy action. So for me, being part of that through Science Meets Parliament and actually being able to observe and understand how those mechanisms take place was really invaluable. And so for me, that was one of the most important things I was able to obtain from attending. And other than adding that comment, I'd like to say that pretty much everything that all of the other panelists have spoken to are not just reasons why I wanted to attend, but also things that I've reflected on based on my own experience. So it's really nice actually to hear other people share their observations and motivations and have them resonate with my own interests.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. So for our next round, it's going to be more of a roundtable discussion. I'll propose a few questions and get one speaker to kick off the discussion, but I'd encourage all participants to join in with their thoughts as they come up. So I'll begin. Science Meets Parliament is premised on the idea that building and strengthening relationships between political leaders and scientists, engineers, social scientists at the individual level will work to enhance mutual understanding, promote the use of Canadian research, and promote science for the public good. So I'll start with you, Matt, just because I know we're going to lose you before too much longer. But from your perspective, and I know you talked about the institutions and advocacy on behalf of funding for science, where this program is specifically non-lobbying, not asking for money. What's the value of working towards that relationship kind of adjacent to the lobbying and for the seeking for funding and that sort of thing?
Thanks, Matt. I think you're absolutely right. The key piece is that relationship building, and I know Trushar and I got to meet for the first time when he came to Parliament, and I've stayed in touch with a number of individuals who got the chance to meet, because anytime in our lives that we can pull on that expert knowledge from really any concept that we've been able to meet somebody or know about is so key, and knowing that likely what someone like Trushar or others have come and talked to me about is probably the first time I'm hearing about it. So, and appreciate the level of simplicity that I find is often need to kind of find when broaching subjects for the first time, and in parliamentarians that's often the first time hearing those sorts of conversations. So I think it's that relationship building piece, but also knowing that I now have a friend in the fisheries industry, for example. If I wanted to go and pull on someone in my constituency who has an issue in the fisheries industry and needs an expert, I then have that connection to be able to build from that. So I think those sorts of relationships were the biggest thing for me. But then also the highlighting of what's happening in a lot of largely universities across the country. University of Lethbridge, I've only visited once in my life, but to hear Trushar talk from not just from his perspective, but a lot of the successes within his institution, and being able to then capitalize on that and share that with colleagues and others, I think is a real success of the program.
Thank you. Anybody else that would like to jump in? Perhaps Senator Galvez, if you have some thoughts? Sorry, I think.
Thank you. I have the chance that there is an echo, eh? Okay, now? Yeah. I have the chance to be a scientist and then now be a politician. And so actually communicating with scientists was never a problem for me because I've been doing this for the last 38 years. But meeting with scientists in the context of politics and in the parliament, that's a very different situation. And it's true that we have to be very careful with the ethical. And you mentioned, Matt, lobbying. And hopefully we will revise the Lobbying Act very soon, which is a very old act that needs to be revamped and modernized, because I remember as a researcher how policy and politics influenced my research, because you needed to go and adapt to what the people in Ottawa was deciding on where the money should go. And so you adapt and you start, trying to meet all the criteria in order to get your proposal. And but I think that there are associations and there are representatives of the academia and of science to conduct the lobbying, and that what we are discussing here is more about building relationships, so like the politicians get more educated and they are aware of how the science is evolving, how technology is evolving, and so that they are more they are building capacity to be able to take very smart and efficient decisions once we are in front of the political in the political framework. When I arrived to the Senate, I was at the I chair the committee of environment, energy, and natural resources, and I am still a member of that, but I don't chair it anymore because I understood that when I was chairing, I couldn't be vocal. When I am a member, I can be vocal as much as I can, and I added that that I wanted to be a member of the National Finances Committee, because I know that there is where people decide where the money should go. And just for example, the issue that this COVID pandemic hit us, and we discovered that we didn't have vaccine capacity, we didn't have, protection equipment material from Canada, and we had to wait it from coming from very far from outside. So that was like a big wake-up call for me, and say, where is our intellectual Canadian property? Where we are with our science and the application and our economy based on Canadian science. So I think that it is both ways, as I mentioned, and it's very important that scientists meets with Parliament and the Parliament goes also and meets with scientists. Thank you.
So both of those comments were very interesting to me. I think we've spoken a lot this week in this conference about transparency in the use of evidence and how science flows in Parliament and in decision making. But now from both of you, we've heard about transparency on the scientist side and seeing what's actually happening in the universities and in the research sector. I don't think that that's a very visible problem that researchers appreciate. Maybe I'll kick it over to any of the researchers on the panel. Is this something that you would have thought about before joining the program? Anyone who wants to begin? Yep, Valerie, go ahead.
Thanks. I think that actually attending Science Parliament opened my eyes to a number of issues, including that point that you just mentioned around transparency and understanding, what those types of mechanisms are. And one of the things in the question that you just asked from the outset is, you were talking about the use of research for the public good, and can a program like Science Meets Parliament play a role in that? And my short answer to that is yes. And I just wanted to share that from my own experience of participating in Science Meets Parliament, I brought that back to my university, to Simon Fraser University. And I actually pitched an idea which we've moved forward on. So we now have, and I'm including in the discussion chat a link to it. We created a week-long summer school intensive program called Research Meets Policy at SFU. And it's a week-long, we ran it virtually over this past summer. We hope to do it in person in the future, where we have a combination of people in policy engagement as well as elected officials meeting with senior graduate students, giving them the kind of training environment that we actually had exposure to in Science Meets Parliament, where we gave them the opportunity to build their networks and gain transferable skills, learn about things such as publishing in the policy realm. And I just wanted to share that less as a pitch about what's happening at SFU and more as a takeaway to show that actually we can, in the university environment, actually be inspired by programs like this and bring more policy relevant discussions in, as well as finding opportunities for elected officials to be part of that conversation. This program that we ran this past summer was incredibly successful, and we're hoping to be able to continue it. And it was really a pleasure and an honor to be able to, build off of the hard work that Matt in particular had done in creating Science Meets Parliament and bringing that over to the West Coast in our Research Meets Policy initiative.
Go ahead, Catherine.
So in many ways, success according to very, very, very traditional metrics in science is a little bit, a senior researcher once described to me as like being a mole, which means that you dig and you dig into a more and more narrow hole until you're the only one there. And that's the pinnacle of your scientific career. And the more that we have initiatives like Science Meets Parliament, where the norms and it institutionalizes a different kind of impact, then the better for science.
So I have a really nice follow-up on Senator Galvez's comment about sometimes the funding is restricted to certain programs, and then us researchers had to apply, adapt the research based on what's available. And I was very fortunate to have had so much funding in the freedom case where I could actually pick and choose within the host viral interaction program that I have in my lab. I can pick and choose what viral system to work with and what host system to work with. And so that was pretty good for me to even pivot some of my research program to adapt to SARS coronavirus RNA research as well. So there is this benefit of having a little bit of freedom in terms of where scientists can spend their money. And you can see when a student comes into the lab and say, I want to work on this particular system, and we have funding support to support them, they are really excited and more motivated. And your points about those, I just want to echo that those are really, they'll be very supportive for us as well.
Dominic, did you want to add?
Yeah, sure. If I can bounce back a bit on what Kelly mentioned and Valerie as well, I think the one of the big impacts in terms of relationship building of a program like Science Meets Parliament is to actually get the tools and bring them back home, into your own region. So in my case, I haven't been able to develop such a nice program as what Valerie described for SFU, but still since then, I've been communicating regularly with the local MPs. I've made sure that that people were aware also of the importance of communicating with politicians. I've been able to convince another scientist from my department to join the newer edition of Science Meets Parliament. So someone is in that virtual program right now. So I think that type of program can be used as seeds, for the different regions of Canada. And we all met in Ottawa, but I believe that we all brought back big parts of it to our respective regions.
Thanks. So sticking with the relationship idea just for a moment, has anyone have any experience they'd like to share about either whether it made it easier in the future to establish a relationship with a politician, even at the municipal, provincial, federal level, or whether some of the relationships that were formed in 2018 continued? And yep, go ahead, Dominic.
Yeah, something that I could add is that in 2018, the local MP for me was Guy Caron from the NDP, and now Guy has just become the mayor of Rimouski. So for me, meeting him at an event like Science Meets Parliament, I mean, it was very useful because now he's a municipal politician. He deals with other types of things, and I believe that in a maritime region like Rimouski, my expertise can also be useful at the municipal level. So yeah, it's all being connected. The federal, the provincial, the municipal levels. So I think yeah, it's very useful.
I will share similar sentiments. I was fortunate to meet the Minister of Advanced Education in Alberta actually last month. They visited at the University of Lethbridge. I had a quick meeting with them, and I was really to the point what I wanted to say in terms of what we do here, not only in my lab but overall in our new science and advanced building. So I could summarize research program on behalf of the entire say campus, the key points and present to them. So that is pretty useful. Yes.
I can add from my perspective, Matt, I guess on the opposite. And the reason I'm here today is because Trushar and I have stayed friends, and I think it's when he sends me a message, I think of the little gift he gave me that's still on my bookshelf in Ottawa there, and it's right, Trushar, of course I'll do whatever Trushar wants me to do. So here I am today because of that.
Again, we're really quick to get back, so I really appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take it in a slightly different direction. Now, Dominic's mentioned picking up a seed and bringing it home. Part of the reason that we reached out to the CRC Tier 2 specifically level or career point is because you're likely to have students that you can bring it back to, and who will be influencing kind of a change, as Catherine said, in the change of the kind of impact that scientific research can have. If anyone would like to share some stories about that particularly, Valerie, you're welcome to continue on to talk about the program over the summer. But anyone can jump in. Yeah, for sure, Valerie, go ahead. Yeah.
Just actually, so in addition to the Research Meets Policy program, and if anybody has any questions about it, I did share the link, and you're welcome to follow up with me by email. Something else that actually I suggested after being part of Science Meets Policy, Science Meets Parliament is, I met with our Vice President Research at SFU, as well as somebody else who had attended Science Meets Parliament. And one of the things that we suggested is, would SFU, for example, when other faculty members or potentially senior graduate students, but when faculty members are going to Ottawa, especially for grant review meetings, which many of us do several times a year, would SFU ever consider picking up a +1 day where they would cover the cost of that day of travel so that the faculty member could actually do their own kind of mini intensive Science Meets Parliament, where they might be able to meet or attend a parliamentary meeting. These are the kinds of things that our schedules don't often allow for unless we're given an explicit opportunity. And I know that our Vice President of Research actually really liked the idea, and is something that I think that I'll be connecting with him about again. So I just wanted to share that as another sort of tangible outcome of this. Just, my own experience of going through this really made me realize how valuable it is to sit in on a meeting, just to, even if you're not going to be meeting people through an organized event such as this, and wanting to extend that type of opportunity to other colleagues of mine. So I just thought I would share that as well. So thanks for the opportunity, Matt.
Thank you. Others? Yep, Catherine?
I can jump in. I've thought a lot since Science Meets Parliament about how to integrate the Science Meets Parliament, I guess, way into all sorts of curriculum, like sort of not at a programmatic level, but also in courses. So, for example, I teach epidemiology for MHA, Masters of Health Administration students, and the MHA students are a really interesting group because a lot of them, go on to become hospital managers, but there's quite a few that have interest in law, and we have like a JD MHA program, and some of them go on to research careers. So it's a perfect opportunity that if while I'm teaching epidemiology that I can convey like actually policy and the attractiveness of policy and politics careers to that group, then I feel like they would then go on to become influencers in their own right.
Yep, Dominic?
Yes, that's a good point that Kelly just brought. I also, in my graduate teaching, at least, I bring in more management issues and how it matters for, in terms of policies. So definitely the event had an influence on my teaching. And it also had an influence on how I supervise my students. So I really encourage them now to take on any opportunity, to communicate, to transfer the results. So I wouldn't say I force them, but I strongly encourage them to present their findings at stock assessment meetings with Fisheries and Oceans. I also convince them to go ahead and give interviews, radio interviews, for example, and just disseminate the research results. And it's been working. They discover that, wow, it's easier than people expect to transfer the info, and it's useful. It's so yeah, it changed my way to approach to approach the way that I communicate with my own grad students.
And I can echo a lot of comments from Dominic, but I also want to mention that I used to only write peer-reviewed articles based on my research and submit to the journals and get it out. Since 2018, I probably wrote over 20 editorials on different topics related to science, and especially last year. We live in Southern Alberta, and we have interesting dynamics, community dynamics here, and I have given. I wrote so many editorials about vaccination. I gave a lot of presentations to the community, not to the faculty, not to the university, just to the community, and it all helped because, as Dominic said, science is not about what we do, but it also bringing it back to the community, to the way that they understand. And it's all thanks to the Science Meets Parliament program, which I attended, that opened the eyes to look at sort of different perspective and just not our own science.
Thanks. And maybe just to look at it from the opposite view, Senator Galvez, you're almost our ideal end state parliamentarian, that you came into Parliament with the full network of scientists and engineers behind you. Do you find that network or your experience as a scientist maybe you have a different approach to policy than your colleagues, and has that had any influence on how others might behave?
I would like to comment two things with respect to this question. We have talked the whole time about how fantastic and how positive this relation is, and I confirm that. But you at the beginning you talk about two solitudes, and the two solitudes are still there, because it is not the 100% of the scientists that communicates with the parliamentarians, and it's not definitely not the 100% of parliamentarians that communicates. So we are still a very little thing there. And why is that? Why is that? It's because I remember when I arrived, some of the comments that were made about appointing a scientist. And, it's like we are in our ivory towers, and that we have these studies that are in the library, in the bookshelf, and that are going to stay there forever and nobody's going to use it. So, there was this perception, global perception about scientists not and I was lucky to defend myself because I am from applied science. So I defend myself. No, 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 no. I have developed methods and treatments and things that are applied in remediation and water treatment, it was water treatment. And so, but I remember these things. And on the other hand, remembering my colleagues, knowing that I was starting in the Senate, saying, what you're going to do there? There are people that are deaf to what science wants to say. So we have walked a lot of path, and that we are seeing some good changes, and we just need to try to amplify this. So like this thing is both ways, and it's a highway both way, and it's efficiency, and it doesn't get blocked. And as I mentioned, we have global incredible problems, the pandemics and the climate change and the biodiversity loss and this. I don't see how politicians alone can solve these problems without the backup of science. And the one thing that also I want to say is that these problems are holistic, are multi-sector, pluridisciplinary, and sometimes we will have the technology, but we won't have the money. Sometimes we will have the technology, but we won't understand the impacts on society. And so we really need to make this a pluridisciplinary and understand holistically and change the paradigm of working in silos and start working transversally and horizontally and implicating everybody in global discussions.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any comments with relation to that before? Okay, I'd like to connect back to a few of the things that you've said here and earlier, Senator Galvez, about the rapidity with which science can have impact on public policy, and the skills built in for scientists to communicate and engage. And efforts to avoid blocking this exchange of ideas between the two sides. I think if there weren't barriers to that kind of engagement, we might see them more. So I want to open it up again to the group to talk about what barriers there might be between expanding engagement between Canada scientists and political decision makers, and what options might there be to either reduce those barriers or to produce stronger incentives. Dominic, you authored a piece for La Conversation on this topic, so maybe you'd care to kick us off?
Yes, sure. Yeah, so I was the lead author, but everyone here is a co-author on the article, and yeah, we reflected on what are the main barriers, and I think two main points come up. The first one being that, and as Kelly mentioned with the mole story, is that traditionally we are encouraged publishing papers, scientific papers, and when you get to be hired by a department, colleagues want to see how you perform in terms of scientific output, and they tend not to look too much at other types of communication, such as policy communications. So we've seen in studies that scientists believe that this is not an important component of their work because it's not well considered, or at least it's not rewarded. You don't get a promotion right now in university systems because you write parliamentary briefs, for example. And so that's an issue because scientists have a very busy schedule, and there is a limited number of actions we can realize in 1 year. And if we're going to do actions that are not rewarded and that can actually hamper our career progress, many people will just give up. And the other problem that we identified is that, and it's probably linked to the first one, is that we are not trained in communication, in policy communication. So there is no training at the graduate level. There's no training once we are established researchers. And so going into the unknown is not easy. We refer to the two solitudes. We can have the impression that, even if I try to talk to politicians, they won't understand what I'm talking about. But when you get into an activity like Science Meets Parliament, you realize that it's not true, that the dialogue can actually be done quite easily. But people don't know that because they've not been exposed to that. So it's been probably two key issues that would need to be resolved.
Matt, we have some questions in both Q&A and chat.
Yeah, we'll start taking those very shortly. I want to give others an opportunity to respond to some of the barriers or ideas for overcoming those barriers, maybe even at the institutional level. So what universities or government may do to support engagement between science and public policy.
In that case, Dominic's when he said that, universities have this metrics, how they evaluate their colleagues, how they evaluate their annual performance, and these activities are unfortunately not being considered. They look at the research dollars that you bring in. They look at the publications that you put in. They look at your teaching. But all of these activities are not, so to say, evaluated in those boxes. So I think collectively, at some point, the universities also need to promote a lot of outreach activities. A lot of universities are doing a good job at it, but not every sector.
One key barrier that I've really been thinking a lot about is really the timelines between science and policy. And both of them are peculiar in the way that they're, the saying like the hurry up and wait type of activities. So both are so busy, like policymaking and science, but there is actually no direct places where they're set for those two timelines to overlap, unless it is, like a Senate committee's study that's planned in advance. And, even then, scientists would have to be attentive to what's forthcoming to have those. So, the connection is often said to be people. So, but then I keep thinking the solution is it can't just be, one by one person, although that's a great start. What is it? Is it advisory council? So, for example, usually, so right now I'm just thinking about the example, I sit on the National Nutrition Science Advisory Committee for Health Canada, but I also sit on the Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council. And one advises inside the bureaucratic apparatus, but the other one reports to the minister. So, that's one way to make the connection more direct. So just a bunch of thoughts, but no specific solution.
Go ahead, Valerie.
I think just in terms of those kinds of tensions that Catherine was mentioning, I think another type of issue that sort of challenges policy participation by people who are in the science community is that many scientists, especially those who are junior and fairly kind of at the early stages of their research careers, feel like they really want to speak very closely to what their research is showing and not expand into generalities, not to speak in broad terms, and to be very careful. And this is what we're trained to do. And people in the policy community really want and oftentimes need the opposite. They need you to kind of speak in generalisms, to say, would that finding that you have from that very specific study hold true to this type of larger population, whatever it might be? And so that is a tension that people in the research community have to walk very carefully throughout our careers. I think as one becomes more senior, you become more adept at addressing those kinds of issues. But to me, this is something that we have to build into our training of scientists. So that way they're comfortable, whether the outreach is from somebody in the policy community, in the political community, or even in the journalistic community, that scientists feel like they're ready to go in terms of understanding how to speak comfortably about these issues that relate to their research, but may not be exactly bang on what their last scientific paper was about.
Okay, thank you all. And unless somebody has a burning desire to continue this one, we'll push into the audience question and answers. And I'm going to start. Sophie Boudreau asked about the one thing you learned from the communication part of your training. And I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to start us on this one and connect it to another question from Jessica Gose about how many of the parliamentarians in the program had a background in science and STEM. And I'm going to connect these ideas because the answer to the second one is very few. Very few of the parliamentarians have any science background at all. Even fewer have advanced degrees in science. And I think we were two in Parliament altogether, let alone participants in the program that had a PhD in any science field, even broad writ. So one of the things that I thought was extremely interesting in the communications training and that I've taken forward at a fairly deep level is to just meet people where they are, not to assume that they know what you're talking about. When you say, yes, I'm a scientist working in a university, yeah, and we've already talked about how transparency is not great getting outside of the walls of the institution. So they may have no idea what you're talking about or what goes on once they hand over that funding money. So to put it in terms of running a small business or trying to manage students, even the word student, you think about somebody sitting in a chair reading a textbook as opposed to the engaged, active researchers that these students are. So being able to translate from what you know and how you think of things to thinking about how the audience is going to receive something was a pretty deep lesson that I took. So with that, I'll open it up to anybody else that would like to answer the question. Communication skills they brought with them. Yep, go ahead, Dominic.
Yes, that's a great question. And one thing that I learned really is, and it was part of how to prepare an elevator pitch. You mentioned, Matt, when people don't understand what we're talking about, they just lose interest very quickly. And when you talk to busy people, you better start with notions on why your research or what you're doing, why what you're doing matters to policy making. So kind of start with the bottom line instead of lengthy introduction of background and things like that. Get the hook, and then after start a discussion. I think that's something that I learned.
So what I learned is both science and political communication need a story. You need to tell the story of your scientific finding, and often that story is centered upon a person. You can just take a look through the Hansard record, and the story of policy solutions is through stories of people. So that's one thing I've really kept close to me in communication.
Okay. Other points? Okay, then we'll move on to the next question. One of them I saw here was asking, as we were opening up the definition of science to science, engineering, social sciences, does that extend into the humanities? And frankly, yes. Even though we are calling it Science Meets Parliament, even in our first round in 2018, we had researchers who were looking at the effect of music on cultural exchange and preservation. Valerie is in the geography department. I don't know if you consider yourself what side of that line.
I'm a social scientist, but there were definitely, as you mentioned, humanities scholars who were present. And it is interesting because the word science, it can be an exclusionary one for people in the social sciences and humanities because it means very particular things. And we had an interesting conversation in terms of our summer program that we ran, ultimately calling it Research Meets Policy because of that. So it doesn't surprise me that people are asking, are humanities scholars included with using that phrase science? But it definitely was, as far as I'm concerned, a welcoming environment. I'm a qualitative researcher and social scientist by training, and I felt very welcomed, and that the program was designed for somebody like me as much as for any of the other panelists that are here today.
And Matt, we do have some of the colleagues. We have the second version of Science Meets Parliament. They are they're from humanities background as well, right? So
yeah, this year we have delegates that are explicitly historians, right? And I hope we made it clear on the application form where we say science. We're talking it. We're not policing what science means. If you feel that you're a good candidate for a program like this, then by all means, you're self-selecting as a scientist in that case. Let's see where else we have some of these questions. These are great, by the way. You can keep them coming in. I just need a minute to read them. What else do we say? Okay, so SM Leduc, as a lobbyist representing academic staff, taking lessons learned from Science Meets Parliament, are there any advice for lobbyists on behalf of science and researchers could borrow from this type of event? It's a little bit tricky. I mean, part of the advantage I think we have is that we're not trying to sell anything from a certain extent. The idea, and I think explicitly stated, was do not ask for money, do not ask for more funding for science, do not say that this should be prioritized over that. That's really not what we're there for. With this event, we wanted to keep it, share your passion, share your interest in it, work to build this understanding, which is I want to say an adjacent idea to what a lobbyist might do. There was another question about adjustments to the Lobbying Act. So maybe Senator Galvez, you have some ideas on this difference and how lobbyists might or maybe should approach Parliament for these sorts of programs.
Okay. Okay. Yes. So the lobbying commissioner have made several recommendations into the changes that we must implement into the into the Lobbying Act and the lobbyist registration regulations. And this has to do with transparency. This has to do with, the time that people dedicate to the lobbying activities versus the time that they dedicated to do their job at whatever company they are. But also, I think it has to do also with ex-functionaries, very high-rank functionaries, ending their employment with the government and then passing to be a lobbyist. So there is a lot of, how can I say this? Is it called inbreeding? I don't. Yeah, sort of inbreeding, and this is sometimes could be dangerous because they had privileged information, and so they can come and actually know very well the system and find their ways to push for a legislative, particular specific legislative agenda. With respect to us, to science, I already said that there are associations that represent scientists and that they come and they will organize events in the Hill to promote science and even specific arms and fields in science. And so this is very clear that their role is a lobbyist. What we are talking here is about more communicating on the content, communicating on the advancement of science in certain topics, and raise awareness and raise education of, as you mentioned, Matt, that there are not many politicians with science degree. And so there is education. We need to raise the level of education and also explain why a policy that is based in science and in evidence and facts is better than a policy that is made in ideology, and for example, or an specific interest agenda. And so so transparency for me and ethics is the two key words here.
Any other comments on that? And if not, then we'll slide to Jeffrey LeBlanc's question. So asking about there's no all-party caucus dedicated to science, something less formal than a standing committee. So opportunities to present outside voices, to talk to parliamentarians without cameras, and whether there's an appetite for that sort of thing. There's at least one. So there's at least there used to be, probably not since the pandemic struck, but there was a bacon and egg heads kind of breakfast lecture series that happened on the Hill, where they would invite people to come and talk about science. This program in the Australian context is strongly supported and in part funded by the Australian government, and through what they would have parliamentary friends groups, which are, again, this idea of a less formal group of people who are just interested in the topic. So there's the Parliamentary Friends of Science. And obviously, I'm not qualified to talk about what's happening inside the walls of Parliament. I'll definitely hand this over to Senator Galvez in just one second. But I do want to mention that it's important that we say that it's among parliamentarians writ large, all of the parties and all of the people that we spoke with. I know it's a self-selected group, but everybody was interested in talking about science and how it can improve the lives of their constituents. There is no case, I think, where we can't find a connection. And maybe, putting fortunately in this country, we don't really suffer from it. But in the Australian context, they were saying, maybe it's not wise to put a climate scientist in with a climate denier. But they will have needs in their constituency for the energy sector or for cattle or for something that we can find a benefit of science. So with that, I'm definitely going to pass to Senator Galvez to continue.
So just listening the question, it remind me of two things. First of all, I think we made a mistake if we forget that during a recent period in a past government, scientists were banned to speak in public. And that was at the federal level, and even it was at the provincial level. I can tell you a personal experience with colleagues working in the government sending me messages because they couldn't say some things. So let's don't forget that. It's important that we remind that things can change even if we are in Canada. But the other thing I want to say in the positive side is that I recently published a document to explain the legislative process, and this was with the intention to invite and help anybody, because I have heard a lot of complaints that why we hear so much about this type of group, which are little, and we don't hear about this much of a group that is much bigger, stakeholders, So why is it this? And one of the reasons is because some groups have a lot of resources to impact the decision at the political level, while others they don't have these powers. And science is one of these ones that don't have the power. They don't have the 50 lawyers going into to defend science and higher education, for example. Just one example, during the COVID, everybody thought about everybody for the money, for the help, for the assistance, except for the researchers that had to close their labs, and except for the graduate students, that international graduate students. So I was like, every time raising my hand to ask questions and to push, but I am one. So we decided in my team that we wanted to write this legislative procedure in very easy words that everybody can understand it, and submit all the ways that you can submit your ideas. So visit my website and you can download the document, and you will have details on that. We cannot hear you, Matt.
That's my mistake. How about now? Okay, good. I've got a physical button I have to remember to press for my mute here. Good. So there's still time for more questions. We have a few minutes left. If you have something that you're not sure whether you want to ask, please go ahead and throw it in the chat or in the question and answer section. In the meantime, we'll go back to one that Kristen asked about, working to change the incentives for impact. I can say that this program specifically is not doing anything, say, pushing to the university system to try to get that changed. I'm not sure exactly what level would go in, but each of the participants has at least their own voice within their own institutions for making that change. Maybe we can open that to say any actions that anybody's heard of or maybe would consider in terms of changing the incentive system, or again, barriers to engaging in that way. Yep, Dominic, go ahead.
Well, what I could say is that the evaluation of professors in departments is done by the other professors. So basically, it's our role to try to change the way that the evaluations are made, and I think the timing with all those questions that come up with equity, diversity, and inclusion should be helpful, because I mean there's different ways to have a productive and useful career in science. It's not just about publications, and it might be the right time to try to influence colleagues and make them aware that this is something that we should consider important, and encourage them to declare those types of activities that usually we almost hide under the carpet. So.
Okay, and with that, I see that we're inside the 2-minute mark. So I think at this point, I'm going to put a little pitch for the program for future years. This is going to be an annual event. Why wasn't it annual in the past? Well, we had an election in 2019, and there was some disruption in 2020 that kept us off the books. But here we're back in 2021, and yes, there will be a 2022 2 and an onward version with any luck. So please, I encourage you, if you found this interesting, watch for the announcements in the future. Please don't hesitate to put in an application. And with that, I'd like to thank all of my panelists. So Valerie Crooks, Dominic Robert, Catherine Ma, Tushar Patel, Senator Rosa Galvez, and our MP, Matt Generou, who had to catch a flight. Thank you all for participating and for sharing your experiences.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.